Welcome back to the Buffalo Reformed Podcast. In this episode, we're going to begin an exploration of Islam. There seems to be a growing tendency to assume that because Muslims are theistic and often morally conservative, Christians should see them as natural allies in our fight against modern atheistic secularism. And on the surface, that is plausible. But I'm going to argue here that it's actually a deception. Why? The West, both as civilization and as an ideology, is built on certain underlying foundational principles. One of these is that each person is created individually in the image of God, and therefore each individual person possesses real worth. That is the foundation. That's the soil out of which our Western talks of human rights emerges. We are endowed by God with certain rights, and the reason is because we're created in His image. Modern secularism, I argue, has taken that idea and twisted it or distorted it. It says, rather, that every individual is valuable, true, and then therefore, whatever an individual believes must be valid. And that is the basis for our modern relativistic and deeply individualistic, but particularly Western view. It's peculiar to the contemporary West. But even within that distortion, you can see that it presupposes a first principle which is Christian and also found in Judaism, that man is made in the image of God. Each individual is inherently valuable. So when asked or when presented with the idea that we should be siding with Islam to fight secular humanism, the answer is the first principles of the West are Christian. The first principles of Islam are not. We may share some moral conclusions or some surface level moral assumptions, but the foundations underneath are very different. I do share a common heritage, like it or not, with the secular humanist. It's a Christian and a Jewish heritage. And the secular humanist is trying very hard, and they do this all the time in secular academic circles, they try very hard to deny their heritage and to cast it into a negative light. I do not have that same heritage with a Muslim, and we're going to look briefly at some of these examples. And there are really plenty of resources out there that discuss the basics of Islam, and so I'm not going to belabor many of these points, but I want to just briefly review some of these fundamental Muslim principles just to make sure that we're on the same page. So, in the introduction to the edition of the Quran I have, which is a critical Quran by Robert Spencer, it says this: to Muslims worldwide, the Quran is the perfect, unaltered word of Allah, delivered without the slightest error by the angel Gabriel to the Prophet Muhammad, and then transmitted, again with no error or deviation at all, down the centuries, so that what we have now is exactly what was compiled and codified by the Caliph Uthman around the year 653. For pious Muslims, it is an all-encompassing guide to living, as eternally relevant as it is eternally unchanging. The Quran is, in other words, a collection of revelations that Muslims believe were given to Muhammad by the angel Gabriel. Some other data: it contains 114 chapters, which they call surahs. They're arranged roughly from longest to shortest, not in chronological order. And the only exception to this is that the first surah is a short prayer, and in Islam it functions similarly to the Lord's Prayer in Christianity. And it is recited by faithful Muslims around 17 times a day in formal prayers. But because of the centrality of the Quran, therefore looking at what the Quran says becomes vitally important for understanding what Muslims believe. Similarly, though, looking at the life of Muhammad, the messenger, is also important because of the number of times the Quran tells us that he is the supreme example of behavior. Spencer, again, notes in his commentary on the Quran that the Quran is clear that the messenger is the supreme example of behavior for Muslims to follow. He is, quote, an excellent example, it says in chapter 33:21. He displays, quote, an exalted standard of character, it says in Surah 68:4. And whoever obeys the messenger has obeyed Allah, it says in Surah 4, verse 80. So, because the Quran exhorts Muslims to model their lives after Muhammad, his character then naturally became a central target of critique for early Christians. Oxford's Norman Daniel, in his survey of early Christian attitudes to Islam, writes this, quote, the two most important aspects of Muhammad's life, Christians believed, were his sexual license and his use of force to establish his religion. For Christians, fraud was the sum of Muhammad's life. Muhammad was the great blasphemer because he made religion justify sin and weakness, end quote. And I obtained that quote from Raymond Ibrahim's Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. So, to summarize that, the Quran commands Muslims to respect and follow Muhammad, whom Christians historically have seen as a man who used the name of Allah to justify his lust and his drive for political dominance. So that sets the stage for now what we can see is what the Quran teaches itself. And this is because, as I've said, the Quran is the central book of revelation for the Muslim, and then the Quran teaches to follow the example of Muhammad. And therefore, what the Quran says and what Muhammad actually did in his life are very central aspects to what it means to be a Muslim. And so these are the two things that naturally then garner all of the critique from Christians whenever we're looking at Islam. So just to start off as the first example, we will look at Surah 1. And just so you know my approach here, I am slowly working through the Quran. And so most of the examples that I have at this stage are coming from the first two surahs. I do have a few other examples from Surah 4, from Surah 78, but generally speaking, where I am right now in my study is dwelling in Surah 1 and Surah 2. And I'm also working through Raymond Ibrahim's book, Sword and Scimitar, and then also James White's book, What Every Christian Needs to Know About the Quran. And these I have found to be helpful and enlightening. There's also a plethora of other video resources and Christian apologists who specialize in Islam that I have been drawing from for the notes for this episode. So with all of that in mind, let's now look at some of the perspectives from the Quran. So first, I would like to point out that in Surah 1, which is the opening prayer, it is framed by most Muslims as referring to Christians and Jews right out of the gate. This is how it ends. It says in verse 6, guide us to the straight path, the path of those whom you have favored, not of those who have earned your anger or of those who have gone astray. So, that is classically understood to be referring to Jews as those who have earned Allah's anger and Christians as those who have gone astray. Furthermore, in Surah 2, in many places, it talks about Jews, or people of the book, who have gone astray. They have received revelation from Allah, they have twisted it, and then they have gone astray. And then it goes on to warn faithful Muslims that these Jews and these Christians are going to try and draw you away from the truth. And so don't go with them. They will never be pleased unless you renounce Islam and follow their religion. Don't go with them. Believers of Islam, faithful believers in Surah 2, are told to enter Islam fully and not follow in the footsteps of Satan. So many Muslim commentators have connected Satan with anyone who pulls believers off Allah's path. So people of the book, or Christians and or Jews, are those who are trying to turn Muslims away from the truth, the true path, and therefore they are agents of Satan. Furthermore, the highest sin in Islam, what they call shirk, is associated with blasphemy, essentially, where you're denying Allah as the one true God. And they believe that if we say that Jesus is the Son of God, is God, then we are committing shirk as Christians. We are committing blasphemy against Allah. We are saying that there is more than one God from their perspective. Christians do not believe there is more than one God, but that's what the Muslim critique of Christianity would be. So, right out of the gate here, the very prayer that Muslims pray 17 times a day frames Jews and Christians as those who have garnered the wrath of Allah, and then those who have gone astray, which would be Christians. And then in the second surah, the Muslims are told that Christians are trying to deceive Muslims away from the truth, and that Jews are doing the same thing, and that anyone who pulls them away from the truth is satanic. And then we find out more that anyone who confesses Christ as God is essentially committing shirk, which is the highest blasphemy in Islam. So right out of the gate, there are mutually exclusive claims. If Islam is true, then Christianity and Judaism are false. If Christianity is true, then Islam is false. They cannot both be true. And so this automatically provides a very interesting problem for a secularist who wants everybody to get along and wants your truth to be truth. It can't happen in this case because we're making mutually exclusive claims. If Christ is God, then Islam is false. If Christ is not God, then Christianity is false. They both can't be true. Okay, so right out of the gate, there is antagonism from these first principles of Islam towards Christianity, and then also by extension towards Judaism. So that's number one. Number two, in Surah 2, verses 190 to 193, there's an extended section on fighting non-Muslims. The Muslim is told to kill non-Muslims wherever they're found, and to expel them from lands where Muslims were expelled prior. And that this fighting is to continue until there is no more alternative religion. So everyone must worship Allah. And this is what is commanded in Surah 2, that Muslims are to continue to jihad or struggle against all forms of religion that are not the confession that Allah is one. And so that's what the Muslim ideal, that's what they're actually pushing for, just as a byproduct of what the Quran teaches. They are going to continue fighting until all bow the knee to Allah. Now, I'm critical of this, but ultimately, there are going to be critiques of Islam from the modern West that I am not going to be in agreement with. From a Christian perspective, we are also struggling against all religions that are not confessing that Jesus Christ is Lord. So on the surface of it, these seem similar. Muslims are struggling with every religion that does not confess that Allah is one and his messenger is Muhammad. And Christians are struggling with every religion that does not confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. But there are key differences in terms of how we understand that struggle to progress. For Christians, we don't spread the gospel by means of the sword. That's not how the gospel is spread. We spread the gospel by means of self-sacrificing love. We spread the gospel by martyrdom, or being a witness, even at great cost to ourselves. We spread the gospel by dying for our enemies. That's how we spread the gospel. That's how the lordship of Jesus Christ is spread. Now, that is not to say that, we believe in justice. We believe in the magistrate justly wielding the sword. And this is where there could be some conflict. I'm not going to get off on a rabbit trail with the recent words of the Pope regarding war and conflict. I'm not going to get off on a rabbit trail on that. Christians do uphold the just use of the sword by the civil magistrate. And so we do uphold justice. And we would say that true justice is going to be in line with the moral law that God commands in Scripture. And therefore, when a magistrate is actually ruling justly with the sword, then that is going to naturally then suppress evil and promote good. But for Muslims, it's less about that and more about confessing that Allah is one and Muhammad is his messenger. And so at all costs, they are to fight in order to establish that Allah is one and Muhammad is his messenger. And that can happen ideally by free will confession. But absent of that, it's okay to, by means of the sword, coerce submission and force them to pay a particular tax in order to demonstrate that submission to Allah. As long as we can establish dominance, then we have succeeded in our jihad. That's the perspective of a Muslim. For a Christian, it's not about establishing dominance. It is about establishing justice. And then it's about establishing peace with God through Christ. So those are key differences between Islam and Christianity when it comes to this idea of jihad and fighting. So it is true that in Christianity we believe that in the last day every knee will bow and tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. But the way that that is going to be accomplished, we believe, is by the free will of people as they are convinced through persuasion that Jesus Christ is Lord, that he did in fact die for our sin on the cross, and he was buried in a tomb, and he did rise from the dead, and now he's seated at the right hand of God the Father. And because of that sacrifice, we have peace with God through Christ. And we remember that sacrifice every Sunday when we come together and we break the bread, which represents Christ's broken body, and we pour out the wine, which represents Christ's poured out blood. We are celebrating, we're proclaiming, it says in 1 Corinthians 11 in the Bible, that Christ's death until he comes back. So for the Christian, our life on earth is based upon peace with God through Christ. And then we seek to establish justice on the earth for all people as we exhort the magistrate to exercise justice in the land. So that is some key differences in terms of jihad between Christianity and Islam. In Islam, they are commanded to kill, to subjugate, to dominate. In Christianity, we are commanded to persuade, to sacrifice, to love, and then to establish justice. And there is a right use of the sword in the defense of those who cannot defend themselves and in establishing justice. Okay, so we've looked at the initial perspective of Islam right out of the gate with Surah 1, and then in Surah 2, how Jews and Christians are framed as essentially satanically trying to draw Muslims away from the truth. And then secondly, this command to jihad to Muslims. And then thirdly, and this is probably the most jarring to modern Western perspectives regarding Islam, and it's the view of women, how Islam views women. So in chapter 2, in Surah 2, women are described as fields which husbands are to go into as they wish to cultivate. And there were some early Christian writers, and Ibrahim points them out in his book, who criticized this view of women because it seemed as though Muslim men were viewing women literally like fields, meaning that the more fields you have, the more fruit you can produce and the more wealthy you are. And therefore, naturally, if women are like fields, then we should be multiplying them as well. And it's true that in Surah 4, it explicitly allows for multiple wives, so you can have up to 4 wives. And if you can't provide for all of your wives equally, then you are to resort to the women who your right hand possesses, which many classically interpret as concubines or infidel women who were captured in battle, slave women. Furthermore, before we talk through some of these things, in Surah 2, it implies in verse 282, very lengthy verse, that 2 women are required in order to have a competent witness, whereas only 1 man is required. And so there is this, granted it was a common Near Eastern idea at the time, but the idea explicit in the Quranic writings that women are less competent than men. Generally, what the Quran is teaching. This is in contrast with the New Testament teaching, where women are often, as a matter of fact, Mary Magdalene is the first person to see Jesus after the resurrection, and then she is sent back as a witness to tell the apostles. And of course they don't believe her because of the Near Eastern perspective at the time that a woman is not a competent witness. But how countercultural is that in that time for the resurrected Lord to appear first to a woman, and then for that woman to be the one that he sends back as a witness to his resurrection? That doesn't really make sense. If you were trying to establish the Bible as, if you wanted it to sound more relevant to or more established, more true to the Near Eastern mind, you would have written it as he appeared to a man first. But, and this in my mind just corroborates the plausibility of the account, that even though to the Near Eastern mind that would have been viewed as a very unfortunate thing, that the first person that Jesus appeared to was a woman, for our God, who views all people as created in his image, he appears to this woman who has a history with Jesus, by the way. He appears to her first and then sends her back to the apostles. That is the Christian perspective towards women. They are individuals. They are not fields. They are to be fruitful, as is the man to be fruitful. And if I'm reading even the Quran charitably, I would argue that if the intention is to say that sexual intercourse is ordinarily to be viewed as a means of producing fruit and offspring, I would agree with that. But unfortunately, when taken all together in terms of the Quranic teaching, the result is that women are viewed as property to be used by men as they see fit, and they're not even competent to stand as witnesses, which is I would say, a holdover from a more barbaric time when women were simply viewed as property of men. That's not even the worst part. So we know, based upon the Quran, it's very explicit that polygamy is okay. We know that women are viewed as fields, and in the worst case scenario, they're just basically viewed as property. And we know that they're not competent witnesses. All that we can take based upon texts in the Quran very clear. But what's more disturbing is, I would say, the eschatological vision of women. And this comes from Surah 78, and it's very often cited in critique of Islam. And so I'm going to do it again, the classic trope, and I'm going to cite it again, because it is disturbing, in my opinion. And I would argue it ought to be disturbing. So Surah 78, it describes, it's an eschatological picture, and if you're not familiar with that term eschatology, that's basically the doctrine of the end of all things. It's how things are going to end up. And so the ones in Surah 78, the ones who are pleasing to Allah are going to be given bliss, and the ones who are displeasing to Allah are going to be given hellfire. Naturally, Christianity basically says the same thing. Those who are pleasing to the Lord, those who have accepted Jesus Christ, those who are not living lawless lives, they will be accepted, and the ones who are will be sent into eternal darkness where there is wailing and gnashing of teeth. So that in and of itself, that binary ultimate reality, is not disturbing to Christendom. However, the goal, what we are moving towards, is. There are different visions for what we are actually moving towards in terms of our human experience. In Islam, we are moving towards a perpetuity of sensual pleasure. So we're going to be given more sex, more alcohol without becoming drunk. We're going to be given all of these pleasures that are very sensual and, from a Christian perspective, fleshly. They're very earthy. These earthy pleasures are going to be given in an eternal state, and it's going to be endless. Whereas from a Christian perspective, though these earthly pleasures, sexual intercourse, alcohol, sugar, like anything you can think of that is pleasurable in this life, these are symbols of something greater. God has created these pleasures as a reminder that He is the source of everything pleasurable, everything good. And so when we enter into that eternal state, we are going to the source of what is good. And so it's going to be post-sexuality. It's going to be refined sugar. It's going to be post all of these things. It's going to be the source of all of these things. Communion with God, the Creator. Everything good that you can think of in life comes from God, who's a personal being, who we can have a relationship with, who we have a relationship with. That is what we're going to. C.S. Lewis portrays this wonderfully in his sermons on the end of all things, which have been compiled under the title, in America anyway, under the title of The Weight of Glory. Wonderful, where he works through a lot of these ideals. But for the Muslim, it's going to be more carnal, fleshly pleasures that's just going to be going on in perpetuity. We're going to be able to have sex endlessly. And that is an extremely masculine conception of paradise. Talking about, if we're talking about a religion that really does cater to male desire, it doesn't get any more obvious than this, in my opinion. The end result of my life on earth is that I'm going to be given a bunch of women that I can incessantly have sex with. Wow, Allah is a very nice God that he has given this to me. But from a Christian perspective, the fact that that is our end desire is a celebration of lust. It's a celebration of the seventh commandment. We are not operating within even the creation order that God has established, which is one man with one woman as one flesh for life. That we were not intended to desire more than one woman. We were intended to be perfectly content and happy with the one woman that God gave to us. That's what our intention was. That is the design from the beginning. God made Adam and Eve in the beginning. And Adam was intended to be perfectly content with Eve. He wasn't given more than one woman. He was given one woman. And that was the woman that he was to commune with as an individual person for his entire life. This is the Christian ideal. And it has always been the Christian ideal. But it seems to me that invariably heresies often allow for polygamy, and they often justify devious forms of intercourse. And that's what I'll get to next. The really troubling aspect of this, we could talk about the theoretical problems of elevating carnality to an eschatological goal. But the descriptor for the women that men are going to receive in this heavenly state is kaib. It's an Islamic term. Now, if you go to your Quran and you look this up in Surah 78, this is verses 31 to 33, and I encourage you to do this. Go to the Quran, look this up, verses 31 to 33 in Surah 78, and you're going to see this description of women as full-breasted maidens of equal age, or in the translation that I'm looking at, it's large-breasted women of equal age. So the way that that's traditionally understood is that they're all going to be the same age. And the word, though, kaib, does mean when the breasts are firm. They're not, it's when, I'll just cut to the chase here. It's when they start to form, okay? Yes, that's what it means. If you look at Arabic lexicons at the time of the writing of the Quran, this is what it meant. There is no other textual way to understand this, although many commentators, modern commentators, particularly in the West, will try to think about this in terms of, well, it's just describing fruitfulness, it's just describing the onset of fruitfulness. There's no way to get around it in my mind. Textually, you can say it this way, textually, the sexual ideal based upon this text for women is girls at the onset of puberty, when their breasts begin to form. That is the sexual ideal. That's the form of the girls that the Muslim men are going to get when they get to paradise, according to Surah 78. And this is corroborated by other Quranic texts, because typically intercourse, sexual intercourse, can begin for a woman with a husband once she can, quote-unquote, bear coitus, once she can actually physically endure having sex, then that's when it is considered allowable. And this is why in some Islamic countries there's not really an age limit on when a woman can be married. The only limit is that she must be able to bear coitus. She must be able to actually be able to physically produce children as a result of having sex. And therefore, once she initiates puberty and starts having her cycle and her sexual organs start to develop and her breasts are formed, once that happens, then she's able to have sex. And it's at that stage when she's initiated into the state when she can bear coitus, that's the perpetual state all of these virgins are going to be in, that are going to be given to Muslim men so that they can forever have sex with them. And if you're a Muslim woman and you're married to a man, you can, I guess, just glory in the fact that he's going to be so happy having sex all the time, that this is going to be the end result for you. You're going to be given a favored status in paradise with your husband. You're going to be with your husband, and then you're all going to be very blissfully happy, and apparently you're not going to mind sharing him sexually with all of these young virgins. That is problematic. And many people have pointed this out in the past. I'm not the only person to do this, but that is, in my mind, one of the most problematic passages with Islam. And it is completely anti-Western. It is, and think about this, in the West, now, granted, if the critique was going to be leveled against the West and say, well, you know, before in the West, women were given in marriage at a much younger age than they are now. Sure, that's true. But in the West, and I would argue, first of all, that was rare. So generally, women were much more developed than at the onset of puberty in the West, generally speaking, than the norm would have been that they would have been much more developed, like 16 to 18, we'll say, when they could start being given in marriage. But it is true that it was younger than it is now, sure. But with the advances we've made in neurocognitive science, and we know now that young people develop into their late teens, early 20s, we don't believe, and this is why our laws are written the way that they are, we don't believe that a woman can adequately evaluate morally the consequences of a decision to enter into a sexual relationship before her neurocognitive function has developed adequately. And so there isn't a possibility of giving proper consent, which is why our laws are geared the way that they are, that they're formulated the way that they are. It's to protect women who have not been able to form in their mind a proper appreciation for the consequences of their actions, and therefore they are not competent to give appropriate consent for that kind of a relationship. Because of that, because we understand that to be true, the laws then, the state laws would say it is not appropriate for a woman to have intercourse with a man, and it's not appropriate for a man to have intercourse with a woman, you can say it both ways, until they are fully developed, because then we know that they have at least developed the ability to morally judge the emotional, physical consequences of that decision. The fact that it's going to produce children, the fact that they are now going to be bound to this person emotionally and physically. All of these things are true. This is not an action to be taken lightly. In the Eastern mind, the neurocognitive development of the woman doesn't even doesn't even come into the picture. And maybe that's not being charitable enough, but if we combine this with the other teaching from Surah 2, that a single woman is not even a grown woman is not even competent enough to stand as a witness, then why are we concerned about her emotional and neurological development before she's going to be given in marriage? That doesn't matter. That's not what her purpose is. Her purpose is to bear children. So now think about this. A lot of Christian teachings are being criticized even now by moderns as viewing women as only keepers of the home who are there for the whim of the husband to bear children. That is absolutely a critique that we should be leveling against Islam. The West should absolutely level that critique. Go hog wild. That is a true critique of Islam. That is not a true critique of Christianity. In contrast to this, and let me just address this briefly, the scriptures presents an ideal woman in Proverbs 31 as, first of all, she's of great value to her husband. Wisdom is personified as a woman, and the crowning jewel of that is the woman that's described in Proverbs 31. So not only is she, yes, she's a source of great pleasure for a man, yes, but she's also a source of general communion, and the sexual intercourse is a we can call it a sacrament of that union. It is a symbolic representation of the communion that a man and a woman have together naturally. So the man and the woman should be in intercourse with each other, not sexually necessarily, all the time. And the woman that is presented in Proverbs 31 is very capable. She is managing properties. She is managing inventory in a whole household. She's going out into society and she's buying and selling and she's doing all of these things. All of these things that many modern women do in Western society. And we can talk about that in a separate episode, but for right now I just want to focus in here. The idea of a woman just being there for the purpose of producing children, and that's all that her role is reduced to, that claim should be leveled against Islam. It should absolutely not be leveled against Christianity. Are there certain Christians who believe that about women? Yes, there are. But the question is not whether there are people who can represent that view. The question is, what is it that Christianity actually teaches? What is it that the Bible actually teaches? And you would not be able to make a biblical case that a woman's only purpose is to produce children and be there for every whim pleasure of her husband. You can't make a biblical case for that. You can make a case from the Quran for that very clearly and easily. Not only that, you can make a lot of other cases from the Quran, right? So the modern Western critique of Christianity regarding women is just falls flat on its face whenever you actually analyze what the Bible teaches. But if you level that same critique against Islam, it would actually hold water. And I'm arguing, why aren't Western people actually critiquing Islam in this way? Well, people are very much, they know how much attention federal politics gets. And therefore, we know why this happens. Pete Hegseth is in the CREC. And so then, of course, Doug Wilson's name is being thrown around a lot. And so then, of course, they go to Moscow and they interview Doug Wilson, Moscow, Idaho. They interview Doug Wilson. CNN has this extended interview with him. And then they really try to bring out the fact that Christians, particularly these Christians, they have this negative view of women, which means that their sole purpose is just to produce kids. And they have no higher purpose than that. So anyway, we can talk more about the Christian view of the household and women in a future episode. But we're already at almost 40 minutes, and I think that I have talked at you enough. So just to summarize, there's been this modern view that Christians should be siding with Islam because they're both moral, they're both theistic, and don't we want to fight the secularists? And I understand the rationale, and on the surface it seems like that is actually a plausible suggestion. But if we are looking at first principles, then we can see that there is no compatibility between these two ways of thinking. The Muslims highly value the Quran as the standard of truth, and then they also value the giver of the Quran, Muhammad. It comes from Allah, but then Muhammad is his messenger, and his pattern of life is to be the standard for all Muslims. And therefore then what the Quran teaches and the life that Muhammad lives then become naturally the two things that we want to analyze. And we've looked in this episode at the Quran itself, and we looked at the underlying, just the general way that the Quran views Christianity and Jews as those who are in a satanic manner trying to draw Muslims away from the truth. And so essentially Christians are following Satan and Jews are following Satan. And then we looked at the incompatibility of even the Christian confession that Christ is God with Islam, which would call that shirk, the highest form of sin, blasphemy. And so right out of the gate, there's incompatibility with these claims. If Christianity is true, Islam is false. If Islam is true, Christianity is false. And then we looked at the way that Christians and Muslims view the spreading of their religion. Islam views it as a jihad or a struggle against all false religion, and they are commanded to reclaim land that was taken from them. They're commanded to kill even those who don't profess that Allah is one and Muhammad is his messenger, and then to dominate all other religions by either coercing confession or putting them under a tax to pay tribute. And that is in direct contrast with the biblical ideal of spreading the gospel by means of service and sacrifice. And then we just made the caveat that Christianity does uphold justice by means of the sword, and that is an appropriate use of the sword, even in our modern context, which is oftentimes not properly understood by modern-day Christians. We can talk about that maybe even in a further episode. And so the idea of how we spread the gospel is incompatible between Islam and Christianity. And then views of women. Islam views them as fields, which leads some men to view them as the more you have, the more rich you are. And there's also, it seems to be viewed positively that infidel women who are captured in battle can be concubines, and they can be resorted to for sexual intercourse if you only have one wife and you're not content. And then to make matters worse, women are not viewed as competent witnesses. And then the sexual ideal for women is at the onset of puberty. So all of those things are very problematic. And then lastly, the eschatological ideal of Islam is more sensual carnal pleasure. Whereas in Christianity, women are absolutely competent witnesses. The picture of women is much more positive than it is in Islam. They're viewed as complete people. They are competent witnesses. The first woman to witness the resurrection was Mary, and then she was sent as a witness by Jesus to the apostles. So it's just a completely different view of women. The ideal in Christianity is and always has been one man with one woman for life. There are examples of polygamy in the Bible. We can discuss that at a different time. The ideal in Scripture that is always what is given as morally what was intended from the beginning is one man with one woman as one flesh for life. And then the idea that eschatologically we are going to be moving towards more sensual pleasure in paradise is Islamic, and that is in direct contradiction with the Christian perspective that we are going to, that these sensual pleasures, which are good, as long as they're not idolized and used unduly, that these are supposed to point us to the giver of all good, which is God himself. And we are ultimately moving towards a fuller communion with God. We're not going to be moving into a state that is filled with sexual intercourse and alcohol. We are moving into fuller communion with God. And we could just say, even on a broader level than that, and I alluded to it earlier, that Christianity is based upon faith. Faith that Jesus Christ finished the work that was necessary to bring us back into a right relationship with God. In Surah 2, they describe how Satan leads Adam and Eve astray, and then this plunges humanity into sin. It's very similar to what the Bible teaches and what Christianity has always affirmed, that Adam and Eve lost their communion with the Lord. They had that sweet communion with the Lord, and they lost it. Well, in Christianity, Christ brings us back into communion with the Lord. And he, on his merits, he died on the cross. He took that penalty, that justice penalty for our sins. And now on the basis of that, which we celebrate every week when we break the bread in celebration of Christ's broken body, and we pour out the wine in celebration of Christ's poured out blood, and in obedience to 1 Corinthians 11 and all the other passages that institute the Lord's Supper, we are proclaiming the death of the Lord, and we're exercising faith that he did in fact win peace for us with God. And so our religious perspective is not one of, am I doing enough in order to have favor with the Lord? Our perspective is, I believe that Jesus did enough for us to have favor with the Lord, and now I am able to enjoy a right relationship with God because of that. And that doesn't give me a license to sin as I please because Christ has paid for my sin. If I have that perspective, then that is evidence that I am not truly a Christian. I am just looking at religion as a way to justify my lust, which is the exact critique we're leveling against Muhammad. He was using religion to justify his lust. For a true Christian, the desire for righteousness comes from the heart. It comes from inside. This isn't something that we are trying to attain. It is something that is only by the grace of God working in our heart that we are able to pursue righteousness. And it says in Proverbs that a just man falls 7 times and rises again. So in Christianity, there is forgiveness, there is grace in Jesus, there is peace with God. This is a religion of peace and forgiveness and grace. And then because of that, we are commanded to extend that to others. So it says in Ephesians 4, verse 32, be kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, has forgiven you. And that is the message that I'm going to leave you with. This has been the first episode as our foray into Islam. I'm planning to do more. We can look specifically at the life of Muhammad. We can look at some of the critiques that Islam levels against Christianity, and then we can look at some of the secular ideas about Christianity, essentially that it's no better than Islam, particularly because of some of these Old Testament verses, and I'll give you a way to understand some of that, or at least my perspective, and what Christian Orthodoxy has taught, and perhaps I will be able to do some of these with some help from some of my Christian brothers in our Reformed community. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Buffalo Reformed podcast.